So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation today. Myself and Marcel are going to talk through OpenChain and the ISO release. For context, I'm Shane Coughlin, the General Manager of the OpenChain project. I lead a large international community building an ISO standard for open source license compliance. We're part of the Linux Foundation, one of the world's largest organizations bringing companies together, building communities and helping people collaborate. And Marcel is with PwC. I'll hand over to him for his intro.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Marcel. I'm by practice a computer scientist, and I'm a director at PwC and head of our open source software services. So from consulting to audits to due diligence to certifications, we do everything around open source software. And myself and my team, we've been following and contributing and consulting and auditing around OpenChain for years already. And we have quite a good relationship to Shane and OpenChain. And I think we're also a good partner for the ISO, which just came out, and for certifications around it. So
actually, when you look at our backgrounds, I'm a political scientist specializing in military security, and now I manage an ISO standard. And you're a computer scientist, now deeply involved in audits.
Audits and compliance, correct, yeah.
We've gone in very interesting directions since college. Well, let's dive right in. We have a series of questions to talk through today, and it's going to be like a bit of a fireside chat. As Marcel said, we've worked together for years. We both have a lot of knowledge in the field, and we hope to share that with you in a sort of quick, friendly format, so you can get a feel of where we're at today as a community in the business sector and in terms of an ISO standard, which is something that often feels quite formal, maybe even complex. Not the case, but let's dive straight in.
Yeah, Shane, I mean, we did have big news this week, right? So perhaps you can tell us more about it. What happened this week and what was the process? What was the journey? So I think it's quite interesting to hear about it from yourself.
So yes, ISO 5230, is it out now? And more importantly, what is it? Yes, so for years in the open source compliance space, we've been working on how to coalesce around single approaches to compliance to make things easier and faster. And since 2016, we've had a standard in the market that more and more companies have adopted and supported. The standard is a process management standard for open source compliance. It's about identifying the process points on inbound, internal, and outbound, where you really need to do something to avoid inadvertent errors in managing open source licensing and copyright. That standard matured and got to the position where we felt it was time to convert from a de facto standard used by the industry into a formal standard. In other words, to go from something that the companies who know about it are using into something in the ISO standardization process that tens of thousands of other companies could both easily learn about and adopt. So our pre-existing standard went into the ISO process and graduated 2 days ago as ISO 5230. In other words, there is an ISO standard for open source license compliance. And yes, it is out now. You can get it off the ISO website. You can get a functionally identical version from the OpenChain project website. And you can get tons of assistance in adopting it, in seeing what other people are doing, and in getting help, whether you want to do self-certification, independent assessment, or third-party certification. That's kind of a worthy overview, but I think it covers the general of what we've done.
No, but it's interesting, is it not? Because we have had this standard for the last years already, but still it's a major step to now have it as an ISO standard, because it just elevates it to the next level. Now it's an international standard, and I think that's really a great achievement which you and the project have achieved over the last weeks, months, and years.
It's an interesting point.
did it take long to actually achieve this?
Surprisingly or not surprisingly, no. People are used to ISO standards taking 50 to 60 months to develop and release. And that's because people start drafting a standard in country committees and they prepare it. Now, we didn't need to draft the standard when we went through ISO. The standard was complete. It was deployed for years. So our process was actually a transposition process, a process of converting a finished standard into an ISO standard. And that's really a vote process. There's no editing involved. So we were converted from a de facto standard into a formal standard. And like you said, that's pretty important. So a de facto standard is used by the industry, your peer companies know it, and so on and so forth. But a formal standard allows sales and procurement in companies which might not have great awareness of this field, but it allows sales and procurement to easily say, this is one of the standards we include in our purchasing contracts. And at the same time, ISO has a tremendous reputation. So being an ISO standard is also a reputational boost for us. The fundamentals haven't changed. It's the same standard. But yes, it's now super easy for sales and procurement, and it's got the reputational weight of ISO, which is great, which is fantastic. But yeah, it's a quick process, the transposition. It took 9 months since we submitted into ISO, they translated it, then the countries voted on it, we passed, and then we published. It's a very elegant process, and other standards will be using this in our space. The next one will be a software bill of materials standard, but that's a story for another day.
Okay, so great news at the end of the year.
Yeah, it's a good gift for the holiday season. Let's check out what's next. Important problems. That's a good one. And there are so many things I would love to say about it, but I'm sure you've got stuff to say about this as well, Marcel. You know, what kind of problems do you see it solving for PwC portfolio clients?
I mean, basically, I think it addresses several issues. So it solves the inherent risks that come with open source usage and the challenges that actually companies face when they use open source software. So particularly it addresses, of course, the risk of license compliance and how to manage license compliance, how to get license compliance right. It also talks about community interaction, resource and skills, and all this good stuff that is required to have a good and quality open source compliance management system. And what I've seen in with our clients and customers so far is that very often they have some kind of fear to be incompliant, and therefore they restrict the use of open source software on the one hand. On the other side, they actually cannot restrict it, of course. And so they're in the middle of this, and they needed to have some guidance how to get it right. And this already was done through the industry standard, but now having an ISO on it is even a better tool, a better measure to address these risks and these challenges and to get it right. So that's what I've seen very often with our clients.
One interesting point about the ISO standard, it goes to a quip, which was made by someone, that they wanted to replace 12 pages of bespoke open source compliance language in contracts by saying be OpenChain conformant. And just putting be OpenChain conformant in a contract is less easy to comprehend than putting ISO 5230. And I think that's one of the tremendous things we've solved today by the ISO status. Of course, OpenChain solved it before, but you might have to explain what OpenChain is and why it has the gravitas to solve it. We do see some interesting stuff as well about OpenChain going in other places, but sorry, go ahead, you had something there.
No, I just want to add, I mean, it also brings in transparency in the whole process, of course. And as you say, it's easier to address within procurement, it's easier to address with business partners, just to say, okay, please take care of open source compliance, be ISO compliant, 5230. And I mean, that's a much easier message to transport than setting up individual rules and contract clauses with the suppliers. So therefore, it's very helpful.
And of course, there's different ways of looking at the problems that are being solved. At a very literal level, you're reducing the likelihood of compliance errors. So you're catching potential legal errors in the transportation of open source code through your supply chain and through your individual company. But that very literal reading, I think, is only part of the story. I mean, why are you doing that? What does that mean? And in essence, by having process management that catches open source compliance failure points and make sure that those points have a process in play, dramatically reduces the amount of resource cost and time cost of the intellectual management around open source. If you and your suppliers have the processes in place, the chance of problems is reduced. And that goes way beyond something like legal liability. That goes into time to market. It goes into remediation costs. And I think from a business strategy point, OpenChain ISO 5230, when utilized in your supply chain, will dramatically reduce the cost of compliance and increase the efficiency of your process itself. And I think that's really why it's successful. You know, if it was simply a checkbox on a legal matter, it would be important, but it wouldn't be something that would be exciting from a business intelligence aspect. But the thing is that we've wasted a lot of time in the supply chain, going company to company, finding problems, trying to work out who made an error. And with different process management or processes lacking, it takes a long time, where this makes it very, very simple. And I think that's an important problem. So direct legal quality, catching legal challenges, of course, but also essentially reducing roadblocks to market, reducing roadblocks in quick remediation, making sure that open source intellectual property management is just smooth, tidy, and quick. I think that's how I frame it. Fair statement, you think, Marcel?
Very true, very true. And it brings us to our next question. So why does it need an ISO standard for this? I think we've already touched some of the points around this, but I mean, I think it's clear whenever we're in a big organization and many people are working on different on the same topic. At some point, you come to the point where you say, okay, we need to have a standard. We need to standardize our processes. We need to standardize what we are doing so that we have the same level of quality, etc. So this is just in an organization. And the next thing is, I mean, what actually OpenChain achieved was to have an industry standard. And I think it's clear that standards, what standards are for, and that standards are very useful in industry nowadays, etc. And when you then look at ISO, I mean, ISO is the international standardization organization, and it has major and very important standards like the ISO 27001 around information security, or the 19600 and 37001 for compliance management systems, or 14001 for environmental standards. So ISO is, I think, is of course the organization globally to put out standards, to manage standards, to keep a high quality of standards. And this provides, of course, a lot of visibility and credibility to this standard. And therefore, it's, as I said before, a major step to have it transformed to an ISO standard. And I also think it is kind of from why use OpenChain standard? From this question, it goes to why don't you use and why don't you apply this ISO? So it's kind of a change in the behavior and mindset, I guess. What are your thoughts on this?
You know, I think from a very high level perspective, one way of conceptualizing it is about how people stack a handful of standards together. So, you know, everyone's got their handful of ISO standards they want in their procurement, and they might be doing, you know, control on quality processes. They might want something like ISO 9001 for quality. They might need functional safety like 262. And they've got this portfolio, this stack of standards that they want to have. And being an ISO standard allows people to insert us into that stack of standards, into their processes, into their mental model super easily. And I mean, I agree with all your points. I think that sitting alongside our peers has tremendous advantage. And it just makes it so much easier to slot into what we're doing in talking between companies. And there is no organization in the world with more credibility than ISO in standardization. And in our process of becoming a standard through ISO, we had exceptional engagement in areas like Joint Technical Committee 1. We had country organizations talking with us. ISO deserves its status as the global standardization body because people care deeply, there are strong processes, and there's proactive engagement. That's why standards that have the ISO number, they are very much battle tested as quality solutions for whatever domain they're addressing.
And also it eases the process for getting external third-party certification. So it's for certification bodies, it's very it's the normal way, or it's usual to provide the certification against an official ISO standard. And actually, there's even a standard for certification bodies to provide this certification. That's the 1721. And so this again manages the quality and the credibility of standards and certifications, etc. So, and it just fits very good in this whole ecosystem of standardization, credibility, and trust.
And it really helped us as a community, I think. OpenChain is run by essentially the user companies who use the code, but it's very important to have an ecosystem of service providers who assist user companies. And certainly ISO standardization actually helps us scale that community because we can look at companies providing services and see how they provide other ISO services. So, you know, companies like PwC or law firms providing legal support, we can see how they manage this approach. And this allows us essentially to build out trusted partners around the world. There's all types of advantages to ISO standardization. And the cost of standardization, the time investment, is not dramatic. The true investment is having a quality standard concept, having a quality standard written. And once you have that, once you have a good community, the benefits are fantastic in ISO. Let's go to the next one. What have we got next? Oh, how complex will 5230 be? That's like how long is a piece of string? It's actually not that complex to get started. ISO 5230 is a process management standard, and formally speaking, it's about having a program inside your company meet the requirements of the standard. So is there a program which has the processes for ingest, internal management, and deployment of open source code from the context of compliance? If you have a relatively small program, and if you have some pre-existing processes anyway, adoption can be pretty fast. But if you have, let's say, a giant company, your program covers many thousands of people, it can take longer. Or if your company lacks a lot of processes and you need to build new processes, it can take longer. But mostly, it's an evolutionary process, and it's not super difficult. It just takes a good mental model. Sorry, Marcel, over to you.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but this is exactly the point, Shane, I think. So, I mean, is this question even right that we are asking? Because, I mean, it's not about adopting the ISO standard. Because compliance and compliance management open source is not optional, and we don't do it just because now there's an ISO standard. Actually, this has to be done already anyways. And that's the whole point. So if you have already built and if you have already done what is required, then actually the adoption of OpenChain is, I think, not rocket science. Of course, I mean, you need to have some expert on compliance management and how to think about this logic, about policies and controls and how to document it, everything, etc. And of course, you need open source experts as well, but this you need anyways. And therefore, if you have a compliance management, if you're already doing what is required, adopting the ISO is not a big challenge, I think. I mean, you might need to make some tweaks, change some stuff. You might need to have some more documentation around it. But generally, it's addressing what the standard is addressing what needs to be implemented already anyways. I think that's important to think about as well. And
that's a pretty good point.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, if a company doesn't have any processes in place, the question isn't, is adopting ISO 5230 difficult? The question is, what are you thinking? If you're ingesting third-party intellectual property, you have no idea what you're doing with it. Now, that's not the case in reality, but it's a fair point that Marcel said that you know, you need to manage this anyway, and the most appropriate way to manage it is probably what, you know, at this stage, tens of thousands of company hours of experience consolidated into a small 7-page process standard. That's the appropriate way to do it, because that's what solves the problem most efficiently. Yeah.
So I guess now is the best time for everyone to think about open source compliance management and programs and getting started, right?
Yes, and there's tons of help. I'm sure we'll dig into this in more detail later. But OpenChain's community of user companies, for example, have built a reference library of examples of policies, checklists, flowcharts, training. There's over 1,000 documents in there to help inspire companies on how other people have done it. So, you know, it's not like you're looking at a blank slate from where you're starting. It's not like you're looking at a blank slate from working out how to put in place new processes. We have your peers doing that and sharing it today. Yeah, I guess it's not complex really. It's just a matter of the mental model deciding to align with what, well, the industry's doing and what now is the standard, or continuing to do stuff in a bespoke way, which may or may not be effective, but it definitely is not going to be optimal from resource management in the supply chain.
And besides all the great reference material you just mentioned, of course, there are also service providers who help to implement and who help get certified, etc. So that's also available. And I think it's all nice listed on the OpenChain project webpage.
And a good point about the service provision is that OpenChain as a project has a mental model where, because it's user companies essentially filling out their problem space, we wanted to have global coverage and we wanted to have plenty of freedom of choice. And that's what we've got. I mean, you have plenty of people to choose from in legal provision, service provision, vendors on tooling, third-party certifiers. And everyone who's in the program that's an official partner is someone that's engaged with us and knows exactly what we're doing. So their support on ISO 5230 will be the appropriate support for the standard and for your company. Let's have a look at the next one. This is a good one. This is a tricky one. So ISO 5230 defines a quality open source license compliance program. Does it improve or enable anything beyond that? Can I have the first crack at this one? Because it's a fun one.
Okay, you go first.
So several aspects of the OpenChain project have run across the global industry well beyond the narrow original scope. One example is our reference training program, made from the combined knowledge of a whole bunch of large and small companies. That training program we thought would be used as a way for people to see how to implement training in the context of OpenChain conformance. But instead, the training program is used for that, and it's also used for many other things as well. It's been a runaway success as a global document. The same thing for the standard. Yes, 5230 is about quality open source license compliance, but the fundamental structure of having processes to identify what is the incoming software and to identify what's outgoing are extremely useful in areas like security. So we do see people using OpenChain in the context of security. It's useful in the context of export control, and people are using OpenChain for that. It's also useful in the context of merger and acquisition. Is your acquisition target using OpenChain? If they're not using OpenChain, how many of the ISO standard processes are they missing? And that really helps with the intellectual management of a merger and acquisition activity. And of course, ancillary to that, potentially in the pricing negotiation as well. So yeah, OpenChain is about open source license compliance, but its impact and its utility goes beyond that, and it's being used for other things today. So export control, security, M&A, all of those things have been in play for several years. What's your take, Marcel?
Yeah, security is a very important topic, for example, because I mean, how can you manage security of applications and software and code if you don't know what open source components are built into these into the code? And actually, the standard here gives you the right framework to address this question and to manage this question. I mean, also, of course, adopting the standard provides transparency throughout the company, and it also helps to better understand the whole management of open source. And besides just talking about compliance and risk mitigation, I think it's also important to think about enablement. So how can you enable open source usage, and how can you make use of all the benefits and all the good things about open source? And this is actually best enablement is to be compliant, to have a compliance management, to have a safeguard, to say, okay, we are ISO 5230 compliant, and therefore we can use open source throughout the company, throughout our products. We have all this in place, and therefore we have a good enablement of using open source. And so we should not just think about boundaries and compliance, and that it's a boundary that we have to solve somehow. We should more think about how to enable open source usage, and we can enable it through being compliant, through having clear process and all this good stuff. And this is the best way to prove management and to prove the legal counsel in companies, etc., that the risks are managed, therefore open source can be used widely and securely. And that's very important to think about as well.
That's a good point. There has been what we could perhaps term a rational, irrational fear about open source, where people are unsure about the risk profile they might be getting in adopting open source. And that's generally departments or industries which are quite new to the field. After a while, people completely understand the risk profile and manage it. And just to reiterate, open source has an extremely low risk profile. If you look at, let's say, litigation and issues around open source intellectual property versus other aspects of intellectual property management, open source is very, very stable and safe. But there is a rational, irrational fear about open source on occasion. And having something like an ISO standard for the management certainly suggests that the rational approach is to use the international standard and ingest this for advantage, as opposed to avoid it because of uncertainty. I guess just related to this, you know, one of the things that happened quickly around ISO 5230 OpenChain was that a lot of mission critical, regulation heavy industries got involved with us. So areas like aviation, automotive, defense. For these areas, OpenChain is a completely natural and effective method for ensuring that the uncertainty around open source intellectual property management is dramatically reduced. And I think that's kind of the enablement that we are delighted to see. And we've learned a lot from such companies supporting us on our journey. And indeed, on our board, you'll find major automakers like Toyota and BMW. And I think their engagement and commitment underlines how not just open source enables innovation, but effective open source intellectual property management enables you to do it a lot more quickly. Let's dive into the next one. Is it complicated to get certified? No.
No, it's not. So next question.
That's it. It's not.
It's not, no.
You can self-certify, you can get independent assessment, you can get third-party certification. And at this stage, all of that has been around for years. And it's just there. If you want to go and self-certify yourself, drop into the OpenChain project website. We have a free web app where you can download a PDF and print it out and tick boxes. It's not difficult, it's not complicated to get certified. And any of the partner organizations like PwC, Marcel, if I recall correctly, you've got us integrated pretty nicely into one of your portals that a lot of your clients use for software asset management. So
exactly, yes. Also third-party certification is not a big deal. There are certification bodies which do certifications. That's what they are for. And ISO 5230 is the next ISO, which is available for certification. And a certification body like PwC does it as well, has a complex management, internal management system for providing high quality certifications. As I mentioned earlier, there's an ISO 17021, which also gives all the rules how certifications need to be done. And so this is all set up already with professional certification bodies. And then actually, it's an audit, it's a certification. So you run through a scoping session, and then it's divided into phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is more a document review. Phase 2 is the operating effectiveness review. So where you also go into some details. You do audit and review processes and take some samples, etc. And then you're already done. Next thing is to receive a nice certificate, which is a seal of trust that your compliance management ISO 5230 is set up correctly and it's certified, and therefore it's a good material, of course, to use in procurements and when talking to business partners, etc. But yeah, as we said at the very beginning, no, it's not complex to get certified.
I guess one way to put it is, it's just like any other standard, and it's a very simple standard. It's a 7-page long specification, and there's a lot of white space. So it's not hard. It's not hard at all. Let's go to the next one. Ooh, why is it relevant for supply chains? And I like this one because we keep talking about the supply chain, but if you read our standard is about how a company ingests, deals with internally, and then exports the code. So how the code goes through a company. So how's it relevant for the supply chain? The answer is OpenChain is here to make the supply chain more efficient company by company. So gradually, as more companies adopt OpenChain, the efficiency increases throughout the supply chain. The whole reason it's called OpenChain is because we're chaining together conformant companies. And with a complex supply chain with tens of thousands of companies, this takes time, but it does work. So that's it. That's why it's relevant. Company by company, process management improves. If something happens on ingest, those companies will find it. If something happens internally, those companies will find it. And when they give the code to you, you know that it's gone through that kind of process filter. Naturally, those companies will want their suppliers to use the standard as well, so that they're not starting from zero or starting from a place where errors are more likely. And that's why it's relevant. It's a single company process management for open source license compliance. But company by company on adoption, we dramatically reduce supply chain risk. Do you have any further thoughts you'd like to add on that one, Marcel?
Yeah, I think we also have a nice picture for this, right? When you go to the next slide.
Ooh.
Because because I think this picture quite gives some perspective, and it shows why is it important and why is it important for the supply chain. And as you mentioned before, each and every company needs to get it right within their company. And if each and every company gets it right within their company and is compliant, the other business partners also profit from it. So, and this is just one picture how you can show what the issue actually is, or what the complexity is. Here in the middle, you see the product, and into this product, like development from different legal entities from different development teams within the company might go in, and there might be business partners, freelancers, there might be off-the-shelf stuff, and so on. And all this flies in the end into one product. And not to now talk about container, because containers even give more complexity into this whole topic. And so how can you now make sure that this product is actually compliant and license compliant when you have all these different parties and different entities and different departments? And then particularly when this product then goes to the next, to your business partner, it might be an end product for the market, but it just might be one part of a larger product. And then again, it's important to have license compliance managed for each and every entity. Here the standard can help a lot. And I mean, that's the standard is actually for, of course, to get open source compliance right throughout all these different entities and partners and suppliers, etc. And I think this picture, I mean, it just shows what we are talking about and how many strings and different code flows you have, and from which different parties risk might come into a product. And that's what it's for, I guess.
Absolutely. And you know, I was talking with some of my friends and colleagues over at Toyota at one point, and it was mentioned that a modern Lexus might have north of 120 computers in it of various types.
Yes.
So you can just begin to imagine how complex the Lexus product as a car is from software compliance. So you might have a tier one supplier provide a computer for, let's say, disc braking. And they are working together with another supplier who made the actual disc brakes and the schematics there and the extra data and so on. And all of that data management, all of that coming together in one piece is only 1/120th of the software product components in the car. So you have to find a way to manage that effectively. The one thing we can say with certainty is that any product more complex than a pencil probably has a whole bunch of suppliers behind it, probably even has a whole bunch of people providing separate software units. So one company that makes air conditioners, Fujitsu General, has long been involved in the open source community because every Fujitsu General air conditioner runs on Linux. But as you can imagine, Fujitsu General is not necessarily the company making the microchips. Of course not. It's not the company making the motherboards. Of course not. It's not the company making the drivers in most cases. So those are suppliers. And if those suppliers are using something like OpenChain, you can feel confident assembling the final unit that all of these components will be neat and tidy from an intellectual property perspective. And I do like this slide. This slide just shows right there, it's showing two entities sharing one product. So that could hypothetically be one of the computers going into a Lexus. And that's only where we're getting to.
Exactly. And just think about, I mean, what is currently happening in the industry, in the heavy regulated industry, which you mentioned before, particularly in automotive. So if they don't have the trust that open source compliance is managed correctly by their suppliers, what they're currently doing is that they take care of it themselves. So they start investigating, and they start scanning the code, and they do all the compliance work which is required. They do it by themselves because they don't have this external trust and seal and certification that the supplier has done it correctly already. And everywhere where there's high complexity and where is security involved, and where it's really important to get it right, these checks have to be done. And therefore, I mean, this puts a lot of efforts to tier ones, but these efforts can actually be spread throughout the chain. In particular, I mean, one supplier doesn't only provide parts to one other customer, it actually provides it to several other customers. And therefore, if this supplier gets it right and gets certified and can prove this, it can prove it to many customers, and therefore it reduces the overall effort which is spent into open source compliance, which is a good thing in the end.
I was talking to one supplier in Taiwan, and they mentioned that they had over 20 different approaches to managing intellectual property because of different client companies. Same product, but they had over 20 different processes to talk to their customers, which in itself is a disaster on resource allocation and on error reduction. It's just so complex. Supply chains, of course, must be effective in intellectual property, and without proper process management, they're not effective with intellectual property. There's resource wastage everywhere. What do you think, Marcel?
Yeah, that's the thing we just talked about. And besides open source compliance that we are focusing, of course, here, we also should think of what we mentioned earlier on security. I mean, also an important topic is security, which is also relevant for supply chains. And to manage security effectively wherever open source software is used, and therefore this is also relevant. The standard is also relevant to get this topic resourced more effectively.
That's actually a very good point. And this is ancillary, it's not direct to OpenChain, but you may have noticed, our audience may have noticed, that things like IoT devices have been plagued by security errors. And if you look closely at it, quite often that's because the devices have minimal security process management and they're using open source code. It's not because open source code is bad, it's because a company with very limited software capability is ordering hardware from someone else, using open source code to get it working and shipping it. But they haven't managed processes around identifying what the components in play are, what version they are, and if there's any security errors with those versions. That's a very big generalization, but it's important because let's say IoT has been plagued by security challenges. It's not because it's using open source. It's not because it's cheap products. It's because the industry is too young, it's moving too fast, and people haven't invested effectively in governance. And the people who pay are the customers. So something like OpenChain, first of all, it tells you exactly what you're using in the product. And as you are deploying that product, you can very quickly check if there are potential security errors, and you can update your product. Something simple as that is enabled by OpenChain, out of scope of license compliance per se, but enabled by using this ISO standard. And in doing so, it can reduce all types of headaches for the customers with security problems, for the actual company selling the product who has to try and update in market and deal with the reputational hit, and for the projects making open source software that is working great, but occasionally might get into the media with a bad name because of a process failing. So that's relevant in security. Export control, again, if you're dealing with a supply chain utilizing code that's moving across borders, do you know what the code is? Have you identified whether you're allowed to export it? And then when it comes to other issues as well, whenever you're looking at managing the knowledge of what you're using and the terms under which it is existing and moving, you are able to solve a lot of challenges. So yeah, OpenChain solves license compliance. It enables you to solve other problems. And fundamentally, it allows the global supply chain to stop wasting time and money because of unnecessary avoidable errors.
Yeah, just one thing to add at this. Also, the ISO 5230, I mean, it doesn't define that contribution has to be done. But it talks about contribution. So it's still the company can decide and has to decide how they manage contributions, but that's exactly what the standard says. It should be thought about contributions, how contributions are managed, how they are done, etc. And I think this also is important to talk about this topic and that it's covered by the standard because, I mean, the whole open source ecosystem and also the sharing and collaboration, which open source stands for and is about between suppliers, between different parties, between business partners. I mean, this lives from the whole idea of contribution. And therefore, I think it's very important that the standard is not silent on the distribution, but it actually says, okay, distribution should be thought about. Clear rules for distribution should be in place, and therefore again enable distribution wherever it is desired, required, wanted, etc. But this is also good in the end for the supply chain, because you can share and collaborate on some of the open source parts that are within your product, and you can through contribution solve problems, getting bug fixes, etc. And this in a big and large ecosystem. Therefore, this is also a good enablement through this standard.
I suppose one good way to put this at a bird's eye would be to say that fundamentally this standard says, do you have a policy for X, and do you have a process to manage that policy? So do you actually have a policy for, let's say, taking open source into your company? And then do you have a process to manage that to make sure the policy works? Same thing on deployment of a product, but also the same thing if you're contributing code to something else, like an open source project. Do you have a policy for that? Even if the policy is don't contribute code, do you have a policy, and do you have a process to manage it? And that fundamental set of questions, have a stance on this and have a way to apply that stance is extremely simple, but extremely effective. And it's relevant to supply chains, because if you're not doing that, unknowns will happen. And there's no benefit to that except to those people who want to waste time and introduce risk. So this is the opposite. It reduces risk, and it means you get your time back, and you can put it onto your product instead of remediation, and so on and so forth. And it makes your supply chain trustable. If you're a customer company and your supply chain is using this ISO standard, they've got policies and processes. If they're not using the standard, company by company, you have to go and see what they're doing. And that's a very arduous, unnecessary process. Let's have the next one. Ooh, how can it be used in procurement? I like this one. Just put it in your contract.
Just say you have to be ISO 5230 compliant. I mean, that's the easiest and also the most effective way, I guess. And that's what will happen in the near future, and what companies are already thinking about, talking about, and already doing. I mean, so far, they have had some rules in their contracts. And as we said earlier, now it's easier not to have lots of clauses, rules, and individual rules, and etc. You can now just name it. You can say, okay, be ISO 5230 compliant, and prove it.
And prove it. And I think this is really important. And this is a fundamental shift in the industry, because if you're not using this standard, if you're doing bespoke language, you literally have to start with open source is XYZ. And in this contract, this means this, you have to start from the beginning, and you're looking at pages and pages of contract language to set context and then set terms and so on and so forth. But literally ISO 5230 has done this work for you. And you can replace 12 pages of contract language with 5230. And in doing so, you're doing exactly what has been battle tested by so many companies over so many years. This dramatic reduction in contractual complexity while getting a boost in the fidelity of the result is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. We're looking at about 30 years of experience in market distilled into one short, effective standard that you can now use instead of all of the hundreds of hours you've put into bespoke language and maintaining it and evolving it. The only sad people might be the people writing the bespoke language.
Yeah, and also, I mean, on the one hand, you can trust this seal. You can trust, okay, this company is ISO certified, and therefore it provides assurance around correct open source usage and management. But also, I mean, again, the standard enables you to get, for example, a bill of material. I mean, how many customers and clients I've talked to, they said, okay, yeah, we have this supplier and they provide us software, but actually we don't get the bill of material right. And then the question is, okay, is it in the contract? Is it set in the contract that the bill of material needs to be provided, etc.? And therefore, again, this standard helps because actually it sets the baseline or the minimum requirement for managing open source, and doing so, a bill of material needs to be available and needs to be providable, and therefore it helps to that you can rely on something, that you not only get good quality and compliant software, but also you get the artifacts and can get the artifacts that you need. That's very helpful in procurement as well.
That's such a good point. I mean, if you're asking for a software bill of materials in the context of open source, like we just said, you have to spell out every detail of that, as if someone had never heard of open source, never heard of software bill of materials. The contract has to cover everything, or else there'll be gaping holes in your requirements. But they cannot be ISO 5230 conformant without already knowing what these things are. So they've done that process for you. And the certainty you need is that they meet the standard or not. Also, I'd like to say that in procurement, it's not just the customer company to the supplier. Suppliers can get an advantage from this standard as well. If a supplier is able to say, look, we have the ISO standard for open source intellectual property management, well, first of all, they've got quality processes in play. And second of all, that puts them ahead of everyone who doesn't. So I think that it's an interesting standard because it has tremendous benefit for customer companies, but it also allows supplier companies to raise their status on intellectual property management and dramatically simplify the sales process to their customer companies. So if a customer company is saying, oh, we want to use 12 pages of bespoke language, the supplier company can say, well, how about we use the ISO international standard instead, which is what everyone else is using. And I think that can help as well.
And you said it will put the supplier ahead of other suppliers. And I think it will not only put them ahead of them. I think in the very near future, it will be either in or out. It will be a tick box exercise. Either you're compliant to the standard or you're not. I mean, either you have a 27001 certification and you fulfill the standard which is required in lots of industries and lots of topics, etc., or not, and this will be the same with this standard. So actually, you cannot even participate in the RFP anymore and give your proposal if you don't apply or you're not certified against the standard. And so therefore, of course, it brings an advantage, but also a necessity of managing open source software correctly.
That's a very good point. My prediction is that in 2022, it will start to look very strange if you're a customer company that doesn't accept 5230, or you're a supplier company which isn't conformant to it. Because then the question is, if you're not following the international standard, what on earth are you doing and why?
Yeah, we are talking about state of technology. And that's exactly what this standard now becomes, particularly with being an ISO. It's a state of technology, therefore it's what you apply and what you do. And if you don't do so, it's questionable.
And of course, this is an interesting situation because there's a limited amount of time where people can't be engaging with the standard without looking slightly strange. But at the same time, it's actually a very open and approachable standard to engage with. It's not hard at all to get involved. It's not hard to conform. It's not hard to get help. We've spent years building the foundation for this to really work at scale. Let's move on to our last slide. All about us. So, I mean, to this point, OpenChainProject.com, OpenChainProject.org. That's where you can get involved with OpenChain. And that's where you can get the standard. You can use self-certification. You can get 1,000 reference documents. You can look at our previous webinars, join our bi-weekly webinars, our bi-weekly work team calls. We have local groups, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India, Germany, UK, and the United States. And basically, you can hang out with your user company peers. And of course, then you have our partner network, and PwC is a great example of this. You can reach out to Marcel and his team and look at the comprehensive work they do on open source, not just OpenChain, but full software asset management. Actually,
Yes.
you've got a lot of resources on your site beyond pure product. You've got a lot of information out there.
Yeah, we have information. We have also studies on open source usage here in Germany, for example, which we do with other organizations here in Germany. A big study. The next one is scheduled for 2021. And we have some information on deals and mergers and acquisitions and open source, how to manage and get it right there. Also, we show how certification or an audit can look like using our tool to interact with the different parties, etc. So there's a lot of information on our page as well, and it's always good to have a look at. And also there's an interview with me about the ISO standard, some thoughts about it. So it's a very up-to-date page, of course.
Yes, I see it. It's just there on the highlighted things about understanding the open source compliance ISO 5230. You know, actually, I think people should also be aware that OpenChain is very much a community. I mean, Marcel, you're on a lot of our calls. Julian from your team is on a lot of our calls. Everyone is hanging out together and working on this because, you know, whether it's a user company or a service provider, fundamentally, this has become the center for us. This is open source compliance now. And this is where we can sit together, share ideas, share notes, and basically make sure that we all benefit from the cutting edge of the solutions in our field. And I think that goes way beyond, you know, people looking at traditional, let's say, areas where you might have a standard which is somewhat distant to you, and then there's companies which apply the standard, but you don't really see how it's all connected together. At OpenChain, we're literally the people who make and maintain the standard. All of the partner organizations, all the official partners are at the table. They're people who join our calls, who create our material, who help translate news releases. And I think that's pretty unique, this feeling of community and engagement.
And I think this sounds like a great closing statement for our talk today.
All right, Marcel, have a wonderful holiday season, and everyone take care, stay well, stay healthy, and thank you for your time.